Have you ever witnessed a moment that changed everything? Millionaire saw her black driver sleeping on the street. What she did next shocked everyone. The cameras captured the exact moment when Victoria Ashford's face turned pale during the press conference. The CNN reporter had just asked the question she never expected to hear. Ms. Ashford, is it true that you fired David Thompson without warning, forcing him to sleep on the streets during last week's snowstorm? The Ritz Hotel ballroom, filled with investors and journalists, fell silent. Victoria, 52, had built a $200 million real estate empire based on an impeccable reputation as a philanthropist dedicated to social justice. Now in front of national cameras, her mask was beginning to crack. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her fingers trembling imperceptibly as she adjusted her pearl necklace. In the third row, a 35-year-old black man watched her every move with the patience of someone who had been planning this moment for months. David Thompson kept a serene expression, but his eyes shone with a determination that only someone who has lost everything and decided to get it back can show. What shocking secret was David about to reveal? 3 weeks earlier, David had been Victoria's personal driver for 4 years, punctual, discreet, efficient. He knew every route she preferred, every confidential meeting, every secret whispered in the back seat during calls she thought were private. To her, David was invisible, just another black employee fulfilling his silent role in her privileged world. Everything changed on a cold Friday in December. David arrived 15 minutes late after spending the night at the hospital with his 8-year-old daughter, who had suffered an asthma attack. He tried to explain, but Victoria cut him off with an impatient wave of her hand. "I don't care about your personal excuses, David. Either you're professional or you're not," she said without even looking up from her cell phone. "Get your things and leave today." David stood still for a moment, processing the words. 4 years of impeccable service, destroyed by 15 minutes of justifiable tardiness. "Ms. Ashford, if I could just security," she shouted as if David were a physical threat. "Choose your next words carefully, Thompson. Bad references travel fast in this business." As David gathered his personal belongings from the staff apartment, yes, she had evicted him, too. Something inside him crystallized. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, more calculated. For 4 years, he had been the silent driver who heard everything, saw everything, recorded everything. In his mind, Victoria had no idea that David had graduated from Howard University with a degree in business, but had needed to take the job as a driver to support his daughter and diabetic mother. She also didn't know that he had an impressive photographic memory and years of experience observing how powerful people operated their schemes. Now, back at the press conference, the reporter continued her assault. "We have information that Mr. Thompson was found sleeping in his car during a snowstorm after being evicted without notice. How does a self-proclaimed civil rights advocate justify this action?" Victoria tried to regain her composure, but her voice came out shaky. "That is a complete distortion of the facts. David Thompson was dismissed for just cause after multiple violations of protocol." That's when David slowly stood up. All eyes turned to him. With disturbing calm, he opened a black briefcase and held up some documents in the air. "Ms. Ashford," he said, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "Are you sure you want to continue with this version of events?" The blood drained from Victoria's face. She immediately recognized some of those papers. Documents she thought were safe in her private office. But what terrified her most was the calm smile on David's face. It wasn't the smile of a victim. It was the smile of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment with surgical precision. If this story of injustice and reversal is piquing your curiosity, don't forget to subscribe to the Black Voices channel. Because what David had in that briefcase was just the tip of the iceberg of a plan that would turn the most powerful woman in the city into yet another lesson on the consequences of underestimating those you step on to get ahead in life. The tension in the Ritz ballroom was palpable. Victoria Ashford tried to regain control of the situation, adjusting her blazer and forcing a cold smile. "Mr. Thompson. I don't know what kind of charade this is, but charade." David interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Ms. Ashford, do you remember this phone conversation?" He held up his cell phone and everyone could hear Victoria's unmistakable voice echoing through the hotel sound system. "I don't care if your daughter is in the hospital, David. People like you always have dramatic excuses. Either you work professionally or you go back to the ghetto where you came from." The silence that followed was deafening. Cameras focused on Victoria's face, which had completely drained of color. Journalists began whispering among themselves, some already typing frantically on their phones. That was taken out of context," she stammered, but her voice sounded weak and desperate. David remained impassive. "Context? Let's give some more context, then." He calmly leafed through his documents. "Medical records for my daughter Sophie, aged 8, showing that she was admitted to hospital in the early hours of December 15 with a severe asthma attack. Here's the time, 2:37 a.m. He held the papers up to the cameras. "And here, text messages I sent to you informing you of the situation, asking for just 15 minutes to ensure my daughter could breathe before driving her car." What Victoria didn't know, what she never bothered to find out, was who David Thompson really was. A magna cum laude graduate in business from Howard University. He had given up a promising corporate career when his wife died in an accident, leaving him alone to raise Sophie and care for his diabetic mother. Taking the chauffeur job wasn't humiliation. It was strategy. David knew that powerful people spoke freely in front of invisible people like him. For 4 years, he absorbed every conversation, memorized every detail, mentally filed away every shady scheme he heard in the backseat of that BMW. "Ms. Ashford," David continued, "do you also remember forcing me to work 17 hours straight on my daughter's birthday because emergencies don't respect sentimental dates?" Victoria tried to stand, but her legs were visibly shaking. I never said it exactly like that." "No." David smiled for the first time, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then perhaps I need to refresh your memory with a few more recordings." The CNN reporter, sensing the historic moment unfolding before her cameras, asked the question everyone wanted to hear. "Mr. Thompson, how did you get all this evidence?" David turned to her with the patience of a teacher, explaining an obvious lesson. When you're treated like furniture for 4 years, people forget that furniture has eyes, ears, and sometimes photographic memory. That was when Victoria made her most fatal mistake. Fueled by the desperation and arrogance that had sustained her for decades, she exploded. "You're believing the word of a driver. I built an empire. I donate millions to charity, and you're going to believe him?" The room fell silent. Every person present had just witnessed the mask finally slip completely. David just nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had been expecting. "And it is precisely that mentality, Miss Ashford, that has brought you here today." He turned to the cameras, and for the first time, everyone could see the brilliant intelligence behind those eyes that Victoria had chosen to ignore for years. "For 4 years, I was the driver for a woman who considers herself a philanthropist while forcing employees to sleep in cars during snowstorms. A woman who donates millions publicly while denying 15 minutes of understanding to a desperate father." Victoria tried one last card. "David, we can settle this civilly. I can offer you generous compensation." "Compensation?" David laughed a humorless sound. "Ms. Ashford, you still don't understand. This was never about money." He looked directly at her, and Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his eyes, a cold, calculated determination she recognized from her own business dealings, but amplified by years of pent-up injustice. "Every night I spent sleeping in my car after you evicted me. Every meal my daughter had to skip because I couldn't afford food and medicine. Every tear my mother cried thinking she had raised a failure. All of that gave me time to plan this moment very carefully." The investors in the audience began to shift uneasily. Some were already typing messages, probably to their law firms. Victoria's reputation, and by extension that of anyone associated with her, was crumbling in real time. But what really terrified Victoria was realizing that David hadn't revealed even half of what he was carrying in that black briefcase. The calm smile on his face was that of someone who had orchestrated every second of that moment, every word, every revelation. For 4 years, she had completely underestimated the man who drove her car. Now, too late. She was beginning to understand that she might have made the biggest mistake of her life by awakening the wrath of someone who possessed not only exceptional intelligence, but also boundless patience and a memory that forgot absolutely nothing. With every document he held up, with every recording he played, it became clearer that this was not a spontaneous confrontation. It was the meticulous execution of a plan that had been months in the making, months of apparent silence and submission. David Thompson had turned every humiliation into fuel, every injustice into evidence, every cold night into motivation for what was to come. And Victoria, with all her arrogance and privilege, was finally beginning to realize that she had underestimated not just an employee, she had underestimated an adversary who was playing chess while she still thought she was playing checkers. While Victoria tried to regain her composure in front of the cameras, her mind raced frantically, trying to calculate the damage. But what she couldn't understand was that this press conference hadn't been an accident. It had been orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. 3 weeks earlier, when David Thompson had been dumped in the snow, he hadn't simply accepted his fate. Sitting on the cold park bench, shivering while his daughter slept in the back seat of the car, he had made the decision that would change everything. Victoria Ashford had picked the wrong enemy. "Daddy, why can't we go home?" Sophie had asked, her 8 years unable to comprehend why they were sleeping in the car. "Because sometimes, sweetheart, powerful people think they can walk all over those they consider less important," David had replied, tucking the blanket around her. "But they forget that underestimated people are the most dangerous." What Victoria never knew was that David had spent the last 2 years meticulously documenting every suspicious conversation, every questionable phone call, every discriminatory comment she made in the back seat of that BMW. His photographic memory wasn't just for numbers. He remembered every date, every name, every detail of the shady deal she conducted, thinking she was protected by the invisibility of her driver. The day after the eviction, David had sought out someone he knew only by name. Rachel Morrison, a CNN investigative journalist who had been trying for years to find a way to expose the schemes of the real estate elite. She had answered the phone skeptically. But when David began reciting specific conversations between Victoria and corrupt politicians from memory, including exact dates and amounts mentioned, her skepticism turned to genuine interest. "Can you prove any of this?" Rachel had asked during their first secret meeting in a dark Brooklyn cafe. David smiled for the first time in weeks. "Mrs. Morrison, not only can I prove it, I have recordings, photographs of documents she left lying around in her car, and a memory that has recorded every crime she committed thinking I was deaf and blind." Rachel nearly knocked her coffee over. "You recorded her conversations for 4 years." "Not all of them," David replied calmly. "Just the ones involving bribing inspectors, rigging public bids, and some particularly interesting comments about keeping certain people in their place." He slid a folder across the table. "This is just a sample." For the next 3 weeks, Rachel and David worked like a pair of detectives. She checked every piece of information he provided, cross-referenced data, confirmed details. What they uncovered was an empire built on systematic corruption, institutionalized discrimination, and an arrogance so profound that Victoria had documented her own crimes in conversations she thought were private. "David, this isn't just about you being unfairly fired," Rachel had said the week before the press conference. "This is about decades of a corrupt system that she helped build. You have enough evidence to take down not just her, but half a dozen politicians and business people." But David had an even more elaborate plan. He didn't just want to expose Victoria. He wanted to do it in the most humiliating way possible in front of the very people she had always tried to impress. The press conference had been the perfect stage, an event where she would feel safe and powerful, surrounded by allies and investors. "She'll try to discredit me by saying, I'm just a resentful driver," David had predicted during the planning. "It's that arrogance that will bring her down." Rachel had smiled. "And when she does, it will be the perfect moment to reveal who you really are and what else you know." Now, back in the Ritz ballroom, Victoria made exactly the mistake David had predicted. "You're going to take the word of a driver," she had said, her contempt echoing through the silent hall. David merely nodded as if she had activated a trap he had carefully prepared. "Thank you for that question, Mrs. Ashford, because now I can introduce someone who has much more credibility than a mere driver." He gestured and Rachel Morrison rose from the audience, her CNN badge clearly visible. Ms. Ashford, I'm Rachel Morrison, investigative journalist. Over the past 3 weeks, our team has independently verified every one of Mr. Thompson's allegations. Would you like to comment on the fraudulent social housing contracts we've documented, or would you prefer to talk about the bribes paid to City Inspector Johnson? Victoria's face drained of color. She recognized the name immediately. Johnson was her most important contact at City Hall, responsible for fast-tracking approvals for her projects in exchange for generous consulting fees. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, but her voice came out weak and unconvincing. David calmly leafed through his folder and held up another document. Ms. Ashford, do you remember this phone conversation on March 17 last year? You said, and I quote, Johnson, the low-income housing project needs to be approved this week. You know your son needs that scholarship my foundation offers, don't you? The silence in the room was deafening. Some investors were already beginning to rise discreetly, clearly wanting to dissociate themselves from the scandal unfolding before their eyes. But David wasn't finished yet. He looked directly at Victoria, and for the first time, she saw in his eyes no longer the submissive employee she had despised for 4 years. She saw a man who had turned every humiliation into fuel, every injustice into evidence, every moment of forced invisibility into an opportunity to gather information. The most interesting thing, Miss Ashford, is that during all those years of driving your car, you never once asked me about my educational background. You never wanted to know why someone with a magna cum laude degree in business from Howard University would accept a job as a chauffeur. He paused for effect. If you had asked, you might have known that people with photographic memories and training in systems analysis are particularly good at documenting patterns of behavior and organizing evidence. Victoria finally understood the true magnitude of what she was facing. This was not a resentful employee making empty accusations. This was a highly educated strategist who had spent 4 years infiltrating her life, systematically collecting evidence of her crimes while she treated him like a piece of furniture. Rachel Morrison stepped up to the microphone. This is only the first part of our investigation. Over the next week, we will reveal documents proving a corruption scheme involving public contracts, bid rigging, and systematic discrimination against minority employees at Victoria Ashford's companies. That was when Victoria made her most desperate mistake. She stood up abruptly, trying to leave the hall, but David intercepted her with a question that echoed throughout the room. Ms. Ashford, where are you going? We haven't gotten to the part about the undeclared taxes from the offshore account in the Cayman Islands yet. Victoria froze. That information was her best-kept secret, known only to her personal accountant, and she remembered with horror the numerous phone calls she had made to her accountant from the back seat of her car, with David sitting just a few feet away. For 4 years, she had treated her driver like an inanimate object, never imagining that every whispered word, every document left on the seat, every private phone conversation was being absorbed by a mind that forgot absolutely nothing. Now, in front of national cameras and all the investors she needed to impress, Victoria Ashford finally understood that she had underestimated not just an employee, she had underestimated an adversary who had turned her own arrogance into the weapon of her destruction. Worst of all, looking at that briefcase still full of documents, she realized that David hadn't revealed even half of what he knew. The woman who had always prided herself on her business acumen had just discovered that for 4 years she had been watched, analyzed, and documented by someone infinitely more strategic than she had ever imagined possible. The mention of offshore accounts was the moment Victoria Ashford realized she wasn't just dealing with a resentful employee. She was facing someone who had enough information to completely destroy her life. I don't know what you're talking about, she muttered, but her voice came out shaky and unconvincing. David smiled for the first time with genuine satisfaction. You don't know? Then perhaps you need to hear this phone call from August 23 when you instructed your accountant to transfer $2.7 million to account number. He paused dramatically. Well, I'm sure you remember the numbers. The panic in Victoria's eyes was visible from across the room. She tried to move closer to David, whispering desperately, "What do you want? Money? I can transfer any amount today. Money." David laughed, a humorless sound. Ms. Ashford, for 4 years, you paid me exactly $42,000 a year to drive your car, while you kept millions in secret accounts. Do you really think this is about money? Rachel Morrison approached with a tablet in her hand. Ms. Ashford, our investigation also uncovered something interesting about the Fifth Avenue housing project. The same project where you dispossessed 17 black families using forged documents. Victoria tried to deny it, but David held up another document. Here's the recording of you telling your lawyer, "These people can't read contracts. Use the most complicated language you can find, and they'll sign anything." The room was completely silent. Cameras captured every bead of sweat on Victoria's face, every tremor in her perfectly manicured hands. The investors who remained in the room looked at her with a mixture of horror and disgust. "David, please," she begged. All her previous arrogance completely evaporated. "We can talk in private. I can make up for all this." "Make it up." David turned to the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, for 4 years, this woman treated me like a piece of furniture. She never asked my full name, never knew I had a daughter, never cared that I slept in my car because I couldn't afford rent after paying my mother's medical bills." He calmly leafed through his folder. "But what strikes me most is how someone who considers herself a philanthropist can say things like, 'David played another recording.'" Victoria's voice echoed through the hotel. "These blacks need to learn that they can't just demand equality. They have to earn the right to be in the same spaces as us." The silence that followed was deafening. Several people in the audience stood up and left, visibly embarrassed. Camera flashes captured the look of absolute terror on Victoria's face. That was taken out of context. She cried desperately, but her voice sounded hysterical and unconvincing. David just nodded calmly. Context. Ms. Ashford. This recording was made while you were on the phone with your sister discussing why you fired 3 black employees in the same week. Would you like me to play the rest of the conversation? Then something happened that no one expected. Victoria's phone began to ring incessantly. Text messages arrived one after another. She looked at the screen and her face drained of color. "My God," she whispered, reading the messages. "My investors they're canceling all the contracts." Rachel Morrison approached the microphone. "I must inform you that this press conference is being broadcast live on CNN. So far, it has been watched by over 2 million people." Victoria turned to David with tears of despair in her eyes. "You've destroyed my entire life. I've built this empire over 30 years. David stared at her with a calmness that bordered on the supernatural. "Mrs. Ashford, I haven't destroyed anything. You built your own destruction over 4 years, word by word, while I drove your car. I just documented it." At that moment, 2 men in suits approached Victoria. "Mrs. Ashford, we with the Internal Revenue Service. We need to talk to you about some irregularities in your tax returns." Victoria looked around desperately, searching for an ally, a friendly face. But the few investors remaining in the room looked at her with the same contempt she had shown David for 4 years. "How?" she whispered, looking at David. "How did you get all this?" David calmly closed his briefcase and stood up. For the first time in 4 years, he looked down on her, not physically, but morally. "Ms. Ashford, for 4 years, you completely underestimated me. You never asked about my education. Never questioned why someone with my qualifications would accept being your driver." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "If you had asked, you would have discovered that people with a background in business and a photographic memory are particularly good at 2 things: recognizing criminal patterns and building solid cases against those who think they can walk all over anyone without consequences." The sound of sirens began to echo outside the hotel. Victoria looked out the window and saw several police cars approaching. "David," she pleaded one last time. "I can change. I can be better. Please." David looked at her with a mixture of pity and determination. "Ms. Ashford, for 4 years, I listened to you humiliate not only me but dozens of other people, employees, suppliers, anyone you considered inferior. You had 4 years to choose to be a better person." He turned to the cameras. "True justice isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring that innocent people don't suffer at the hands of those who abuse power. As federal agents approached Victoria with arrest warrants, she finally understood the true extent of her downfall. In a matter of hours, she had lost her company, her reputation, her freedom, and most importantly, the respect she had spent decades building. David watched as she was led out of the hall, her handcuffs reflecting the camera lights. For 4 years, she had treated him as if he were invisible. Now, ironically, she was the one who would disappear from the society she valued so much, while he emerged as a symbol of dignity and strategic intelligence. But as Victoria faced the consequences of decades of arrogance and prejudice, one question remained. Is the fall of a tyrant enough to heal the wounds of all those who suffered in silence? Or are there even deeper lessons about justice and redemption waiting to be revealed? 6 months later, David Thompson sat in his new office on the 23rd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, looking out at the city through panoramic windows. As executive director of the Social Justice Foundation he had created with the money from the rights to his story, he had turned his experience into a platform to help other exploited workers. Victoria Ashford, on the other hand, was serving a 5-year sentence for tax evasion and corruption. Her assets had been confiscated, her contracts cancelled, her reputation destroyed forever. The woman who had once considered David invisible was now just a number in the prison system. "Dad, do you regret exposing her like that?" Sophie asked during dinner at his new apartment. David smiled, hugging his daughter. "Princess, I didn't destroy Victoria Ashford. I just showed the world who she really was behind her philanthropist mask. True revenge was never about humiliating her. It was about building something better than she ever could." David's foundation had already helped more than 200 workers from abusive employers. Always with a motto he had learned the hard way. The best revenge is the success your enemies never thought possible. If this story of transformation touched your heart, subscribe to the Black Voices channel for more stories that prove that no matter how powerful those who try to destroy you are, true strength lies in using injustice as fuel to build something greater than anyone dared to name.